Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Diary by Miss Reed. Mrs. Pringle collects our metal milk tops for blind dogs, as she herself asserts. Despite careful explanation on my part to the children, I'm quite sure that they imagine that Mrs. Pringle purchases spectacles in various sizes to fit myopic peaks or bloodhounds, as this phrase is in general use. It was while she was stuffing these tops into her shiny black bag that she told me a little more about education in Fairacre over 40 years ago. "Not all this playing about when I was in the infants' room," she said flatly. "We was kept down to pothooks and hangers on our slates and then on paper until we could do 'em absolutely perfect. Time was I was 6, I could write a good copperplate hand better than your top ones can these days." Even allowing for Mrs. Pringle's self-esteem and the rosy veil which covers distant years, I could well believe this assertion. I have come across old exercise books and fair copies which have won prizes in their time, and certainly the standard of penmanship was far ahead of anything that I can get my own pupils to produce. In arithmetic and reading, too, Mrs. Pringle's generation, as a whole, reached a high standard rather earlier than the present Fairacre pupils. Of course, there were the ineducable, and I suspect several rather backward children who were dumped in with the ineducables, and might have done better with more individual help, which they would have had these days. Discipline was rigid, and almost all the hours of the timetable were devoted to the 3 R's in some form. I do not regret the somewhat lower standard of early attainment in the 3 R's, except for the modern laissez-faire attitude to reading, which is a personal hobby horse of mine, and on which I entered the lists against Mr. Arnold recently. For there is no doubt that today's children have a much wider and better balanced grounding. Physical training, personal hygiene, school milk and meals, the medical services, and better school conditions have all contributed to the wonderful improvement in their physique. The timetable embraces handwork of every description, music, both to listen to and of their own making with the percussion band and singing, educational visits, and much valuable material put out by the school's broadcasting service and the mobile film units, which range the countryside. There is no doubt that the children today are much more responsible, friendly, and alert, and though their ability and dexterity in the basic 3 R's may not compare favorably with their parents at, say, the age of 8 years, yet I am positive that they become as proficient in the end and have a multitude of other interests in addition. What I do feel that modern children lack, when compared with the earlier generation, is concentration and sheer dogged grit to carry a long job through. Teaching through playing is right. It is in fact the only way to teach young children, but as they get older, they find that any attainment needs application, and fun alone will not bring completion to a project. This is the danger point. The older generation, resigned to humdrum methods and a whacking here and there if there were any marked falling off from hard work, got almost all their satisfaction from seeing the job completed and perhaps a word or two of approval as a tidbit. They were geared, as it were, to low returns for much effort. The child today, used as he is to much praise and encouragement, finds it much more difficult to keep going as his task gets progressively long. Helping children to face up to a certain amount of drudgery, cheerfully and energetically, is one of the biggest problems that teachers in these days of ubiquitous entertainment have to face in our schools. And the negative attitude in so many homes of how much money can I get for how little work does nothing to help them in their daily battle. I have been forced to have a day off from school, the first since I have taught here, as I have been prey to rending toothache. It began last night, soon after I had got to bed, and recurred every 20 minutes with awful intensity. I spent the night roaming the house, completely demoralized with pain, and quite powerless to overcome it with aspirin, oil of cloves, hot water bottles, or any other comforts. It made me realize how much one's mind is at the mercy of one's physical well-being, as at times I felt quite demented. My admiration for people who withhold information under torture has increased tenfold since this ghastly night, for I am certain that even the threat of such pain would be enough to make me blab out any secret, and even to make up further disclosures if I felt these might mitigate the pain at all. Truly a most shattering revelation. My kind dentist in Caxley sees emergency cases at 9:30 each morning, and having explained the position to Miss Clare, who was all sympathy and understanding, I left her in charge, drove to Caxley, and presented my woebegone visage for inspection. Mr. Chubb, that angel of mercy, decreed, "A little snooze and they'll never hurt again." Never was a patient so eager to breathe in gas, and within an hour I was back in Fairacre, minus 2 back teeth, and brimming with thankfulness. Miss Clare insisted on my going to bed, brought me hot milk, and tucked me in. I am ashamed to admit that I slept like a top from 11 o'clock to 4. I awoke to hear the children whooping and laughing as they ran out of school, and to hear the clock on St. Patrick's spire striking. A most unusual day for a headmistress. Most assuredly, the blessing of good health, which I blithely take for granted, will be more esteemed by me in the future. The vicar called in to bring me news of the scripture examination, which is to take place next week. This is an annual affair under the auspices of the diocese, and usually a clergyman from a nearby village examines the children orally in the morning, and the afternoon is given as a holiday. The children usually enjoy this departure from school routine, and we have had some very interesting talks and sound teaching from most of our visiting examiners. This year, an old friend of Mr. Partridge's, recently returned from Africa and newly settled in the neighborhood, has been selected by the board to visit Fairacre and to donate the bishop's Bibles to the most worthy pupils here. He also brought an invitation to tea from Mrs. Partridge, so that after school I put on one of my new frocks made by Mrs. Moffat and made my way to the vicarage. The Gloire de Dijon rose, which scrambles over the front of the vicarage, was a mass of bloom and bumbling with bees. I remembered how much Mrs. Bradley had admired it at the fete last year, and inquired after the old lady's health. "Excellent, excellent," said the vicar plummily through a mouthful of rich fruit cake. "Told me to burn my gloves, just think of that." He beamed delightedly at the idea. Privately, I was in complete agreement with the irascible Mrs. Bradley's direction, for the vicar's aged leopard-skin gloves molt far too often on my own desk for my liking. "I laughed," said the vicar, repeating the process heartily. "I just laughed. They'll do many a winter yet," I told the dear old lady. "She will have her little joke, you know." "She has her likes and dislikes, as we all have," commented Mrs. Partridge, filling teacups placidly. "Loves and hates, I should have said in Mrs. Bradley's case," I added. "She is a person of strong feeling." "Who isn't?" said Mrs. Partridge, stirring her cup lazily. "Even the mildest person has some particular private hatreds locked up like tigers inside him." "Oh, come, my dear," protested the vicar, and rushing in where angels fear to tread. "I'm quite positive that you, for instance, have no such violent passions." "On the contrary," replied Mrs. Partridge with the greatest composure, "I have 2 great ramping, roaring hatreds of which happily you are unaware, Gerald." The vicar's gentle countenance clouded over, and his mouth fell slightly open. His wife surveyed him blandly. "They are cruelty to animals and spitting," she announced with decision, passing the sugar basin to her astounded husband. "My dear, really, my dear," stammered the poor fellow, and so flustered was he at his wife's shocking revelation that he put a large lump of sugar into his mouth instead of his cup, and crunched unhappily while our conversation turned to the happier subject of the pageant. Mrs. Pringle, it appears, has taken umbrage because some malicious busybody saw fit to report Arthur Cogg's comments on Mrs. Pringle's probable appearance in armor. A much bowdlerized version of Arthur Cogg's remarks was to the effect that Mrs. P. would resemble a so-and-so bulletproof tank, and that she would be enough to make a cat laugh. This insult Mrs. Pringle retailed to Mrs. Partridge, and declared herself not only a deserter from the ancient Britons, but hinted at a possible removal from the low company of Fairacre altogether, drawing a gloomy picture of the village's future without her indispensable support. Mrs. Partridge had not batted an eyelid, evidently, and had soothed the savage breast with honeyed words. Mrs. Pringle had allowed herself to be persuaded against such a dire decision, and returned to her cottage with honor avenged and an armful of flowers. "I've asked her to count heads for us at the outing," went on Mrs. Partridge. "She loves to be in charge of something, and Gerald finds counting 2 busloads of fidgety people almost impossible." "Where is it to be this year?" I asked. "We have an annual church outing comprising the school children and their mothers, the choir, bell ringers, and anyone else remotely connected with St. Patrick's." "Beresford again," said Mrs. Partridge. "It takes a lot of beating, and Bunces always do such a good tea. Gerald says almost everyone has put Beresford on the list in the church porch. Oh, yes, and another piece of good news. Mr. Maughan has asked if he can come with us. Now, isn't that nice?" She smiled at me with a mixture of triumph and gratification, which I found almost insupportable. "Poor man," she continued happily. "He leads such a lonely life. So sad that he has lost his wife." "When did she die?" I asked. Mrs. Partridge looked momentarily disconcerted. "Well, do you know, I've never quite found out. I gather from John Parr that Mr. Maughan has been alone for several years." "He has a portrait of her in his rooms," vouchsafed the vicar. "A handsome girl." "Of course he never mentions her," went on Mrs. Partridge, "but naturally he wouldn't, would he?" "Thoughts that too often lie too deep for tears," quoted the vicar sadly, and was about to add a gusty sigh, which luckily took a wrong turning and was transformed into a mighty sneeze, which considerably relieved the melancholy of the moment. "Well, we must all do what we can to cheer him up," said Mrs. Partridge briskly, in her President of the W.I. manner. "I have promised him a seat by you, so that you can both enjoy a really long chat on the way to Beresford. You do him a lot of good, you know." I felt quite unequal to responding to this alarming speech, except in strong terms which I knew I should later regret. So I made my farewells as civilly as I could under such provocation, and returned through the golden evening to my own quiet house, debating meanwhile which was harder to bear, Mrs. Pringle's roguish innuendos, or Mrs. Partridge's businesslike and unwelcome forwarding of my affairs. The Moffats are taking their summer holiday early this year, which means that Linda has to miss a fortnight at school. The little kitten has grown into a bigger cat than my Tibby, and I offered to feed him while they were away. Mrs. Moffat was delighted and refused to take her proper payment for a skirt she had altered for me. "Shall I give you the key, or shall I put it in the usual hiding place?" she asked. "We always put it behind the oil can in the shed." I decided to take the key with me, and walked home thinking of all the hiding places in Fairacre that I knew for our village keys. Mrs. Willett puts hers under the outside doormat. Mrs. Pringle, who has a weighty monster which looks as though it belongs to Canterbury Cathedral, lodges hers in a beam under her front thatch. Miss Clare hangs hers by a loop of string inside her coal shed. Mrs. Waits, in Tyler's Row, hides hers under a large white shell beside her front door, while slatternly Mrs. Coggs next door puts hers under the old bucket that serves for a dustbin. Mrs. Partridge drops hers inside the left gun boot of a pair that stands on her porch as a challenge to the weather, and my own is lodged on a jutting brick by the back door. We all know each other's key places, and it says much for Fairacre's honesty that there is remarkably little pilfering. If anyone's house were to be broken into, the first cry would be, "A stranger must have done it." The day of the scripture examination dawned hot and cloudless. The children arrived looking fresh and expectant. Their mothers always take especial pains to dress them well for the bishop's exam, which they remember as an important event from their own school days. In many a Fairacre home, the bishop's Bible, presented so many years ago, has pride of place on the front parlor table. The boys had smoothed down their locks with wet brushes, and even Earl's crew cut shone with some strange unguent. His normally vivid shirt had been exchanged for one of dazzling whiteness, and he presented a sober and sedate picture of American childhood. Even the Coggs family appeared to have met soap and water in a rather less perfunctory manner than was usual, and I felt sure that our visitor, even if he found our godliness a little deficient, could not fault our cleanliness. At 10 o'clock, footsteps were heard and men's voices. Mr. Partridge ushered in his friend, the Reverend James Enderby. The children leapt to their feet, and introductions were made. Our examiner was in exact contrast to Mr. Partridge, who was tall, thin, and very gentle. Mr. Enderby was a stocky man, short-necked and red-faced, and walked about the room with impatient strides. The children watched, fascinated. Mr. Partridge made his farewells, regretting that he could not persuade his friend to stay to lunch, and assuring him that the 11:30 bus to Caxley would connect comfortably with the 12:15 bus, which was to carry him to a Rural conference at the other end of the county. "Now," said Mr. Enderby briskly as the door closed behind the vicar's linen summer jacket, "we'll put this where we can see it." He pulled a large silver watch out with a fussy tick and propped it against the inkstand. After a short prayer, during which I noticed many a half-shut eye peeping at this unusually businesslike visitor, the children were settled in their seats. I retreated to a chair in the corner, and the scripture examination began. Our syllabus had included the story of Joseph in the Old Testament and John the Baptist in the New, and it was these two particular stories that Mr. Enderby concentrated on. He gave an admirably lucid and terse resume of Joseph's history to refresh his hearers' memories, and then began more detailed questioning. It was doubtful to me if many of the children had followed his swift account clearly, for they are used to a much slower tempo, and in any case were somewhat overawed by the visitor and becoming drowsy with the growing heat. Ernest and Eric, however, struggled nobly with the questions, and I wished that Linda Moffat had been present to answer with her quick intelligence, instead of being far away on the sunny beach at Bournemouth. Several of the younger ones slid lower in their seats and allowed the fire of questioning to go over their heads. The door, propped open with Mr. Willett's flower pot, gave a glimpse of the summer world outside. The distant downs shimmered in a blue haze, and the air was murmurous with myriad insect wings. From my garden came the scent of pinks, and on the desk, hard by Mr. Enderby's watch, a rose dropped fleshy petals now and again with a little pattering. I watched Tibby swing indolently across the playground and collapse in the cool grass beneath the elm trees. A blackbird, motionless nearby, with beak half agape, watched him too, with no fear, confident that such heat killed all enmity. Meanwhile, the rapid questioning continued. "And who was it ruled in Egypt at this time?" There was a sluggish silence. "Come now," Mr. Enderby glanced at his watch. "Come along, who ruled in Egypt?" Patrick, in the front row, stirred uneasily. "God?" he hazarded. No, not God," said Mr. Enderby with firm kindness. Silence fell again, and with a second glance at his timepiece, Mr. Enderby was obliged to answer his question himself. "Pharaoh. The ruler of Egypt was called Pharaoh. Who remembers that?" As one man, Fairacre School raised sticky and untruthful hands. Good. Well, who remembers the name of the Egyptian man that Joseph worked for?" Silence fell again. In the far distance, a cuckoo called, and another rose petal fluttered to join the pink shells on the desk. "It begins with the same letter as Pharaoh," urged Mr. Enderby. Joseph Coggs let out a mighty yawn. Ernest, who was really trying, said in a perplexed voice, "Farouk, sir?" He was very properly ignored. Mr. Enderby's questing finger roamed around the class like a searchlight, but no one ventured any further revelation. He pounced again on poor Patrick. God? Said Patrick once more, with doubt this time. Potiphar, said Mr. Enderby loudly. Joseph worked for Potiphar. He cast me a look more in sorrow than in anger and started afresh with the New Testament. The clock crept on to 11:15. The questions were as brisk as ever, but the answers came with increasing languor. Joseph Coggs had given up all attempts at listening, and with his head pillowed on his arms and his eyes half shut, hummed a tuneless lullaby to himself. Ernest was our only mainstay, supported at times by Earl, who was treating the occasion with unaccustomed solemnity, like some chance sightseer who, thrusting cheerfully at a cathedral door, finds himself in the midst of a choral Eucharist. And what sort of man was John the Baptist? Inquired Mr. Enderby of this freckle-faced listener. I guess he kind of reckoned the people needed news, and he was the one who brought 'em the news, said Earl sagely. Mr. Enderby smiled his approval. And who was he bringing news of? Persisted Mr. Enderby. Ernest opened his mouth to speak and shut it again. Earl was now groveling under his desk for a dropped pencil. The rest of Fairacre School would have been better off in their beds for all the interest they were taking. Poor Patrick again fell prey to that probing finger. Jerked back from some private daydream, he gave his only answer. God? He repeated. Mr. Enderby curbed his exasperation laudably and said, In a way, yes, in a way. Ernest, emboldened, gave the right answer, and all was well. I felt rather sorry for Patrick. His stock answer, so safe and so often right, had not stood him in good stead this morning. At 2 minutes before the half-hour, Mr. Enderby congratulated the children and me on a good year's work and on their alert answering and courteous behavior. He promised to send the bishop's Bible to Ernest, who was pink with delight, and stammered polite thanks. Mr. Enderby then hurried away to catch his bus. Please, miss, can I have a drink of water? Pleaded Joseph Coggs as the footsteps died away. His cry was taken up by a thirsty chorus. The long-awaited scripture examination was over for another year, and Fairacre School looked forward, after all its exertions, to a glorious half-holiday amidst all the country delights of a June afternoon. And we will proceed to July next time.